Hello, welcome to Latina Prima, first year Latin. My name is Alex Ring. I'll be your teacher for this. I've been teaching Latin for a number of years. I love doing it. I love exposing people to the Latin language. Before we get started, especially for the first year, I just want to let you know what I hope you're going to get out of Latin, why we do this. You'll hear a lot of things about root words and how useful it is, especially if you're going into medicine, and all of that is true. But when I have students, what I hope they get out first is I hope you get a better understanding of English. Many of you probably had some sort of English grammar course. Learning English grammar as a native speaker of English is hard. It's hard because you already know the language. What I tell people, it's like trying to read the label, but you're on the inside of the jar. In learning Latin, now we get to learn grammar in another language, which will now help us understand the way that English grammar works. Sometimes people will ask, well, why can't we just do this with something like French or Spanish or German or Japanese? And you can, but the hard part there is that those are all living languages. Languages change as they're spoken, but Latin won't. Latin is an ancient language, and so its grammar is pretty much set. And that makes it easier to learn the grammar and thus to see how English grammar also works. Having a better understanding of the English grammar is going to make you a better communicator and a better writer, and this you will also find helpful. I also hope you get a better understanding of history out of learning Latin. Most of the stories we're going to read take part in about 100 years after the birth of Jesus. We're going to get to read from Latin writers and hear their perspective on history. This is especially helpful for us as Christians. This is when the New Testament was being written. And so in learning some of this history, we're going to see the unique perspectives that a lot of the New Testament writers had on history because they're products of their age, products of their time. I hope some of that is reflected now as you get to learn Latin. And finally, of course, I hope you develop an appreciation for the Latin language. Every language has its own unique characteristics. I hope you get to see some of them in Latin. I hope you get to learn to love the language as much that I have learned to love it. So with that, if you look on page 2 in your book, you'll see that stage 1 is entitled Caecilius. Caecilius, this is a real person. That picture you're looking at is from a sculpture dug up in Pompeii. This man's name is Lucius Caecilius Jucundus. So this is a real person. The textbook is going to develop a story around him. Now, of course, the story is made up, but the person is real. So we can kind of say this is, I guess, based on a true story. But again, before starting, I just want to give pauca suggestiones legenti linguae latinae. This is a few suggestions for reading Latin. So one of the important things we have to remember is that languages are not codes. We can't always have a one-to-one correspondence between a word in Latin and a word in English. We want to learn how to translate. And the best way to do that is first read the text, and it's best to read the text out loud. When you do your first reading, don't worry about understanding every word and phrase. Just slowly read the text out loud so that the language starts to get into your brain. After you've read through the section once, now go back and read it again. This is the time when you should focus on translating. So you can make a translation that second time around. As a rule, you should treat Latin the way you would treat English, and that is when you run into words you don't understand, you should just skip them. Skip them, come back to them. Let's see if the context will help us. If the context doesn't help, that's fine. Then we start looking them up. You'll see for your first assignment, there's a glossary. It's on page 6, but we'll look at that only as we need to. You can parse harder words. When we find a word and we don't know what it is, we can't seem to find it in a dictionary, then we start to parse it. That is, we start to identify how the word is being used grammatically in the sentence. We'll do a lot more of this as we go along. At the first number of lessons, we won't need to do too much parsing, although I will often point it out to you. Finally, never make notes in your book. Never make notes about grammar or about the meanings of words in the book, not even in pencil. The reason for this is so that you start to develop the skill of reading Latin fluently. So not treating it like a code. It's fine. If you want to make notes, make them off on a separate sheet of paper or in a notebook about the meaning of a word or the parsing of a word, but don't make notes in your book. Learn to read the Latin just like you learn to read English. With that in mind, you can look at page 2. I'm going to follow the suggestions that I gave to you. I'm going to read through the assignment in Latin. I won't do any translating. I'm just going to read through it for you. I'm also going to read, your sentences are numbered. I'm going to read the numbers for you as well. Familia. Unus. Caecilius est pater. Duo. Metella est mater. Trio. Quintus est filius. Quartus. Lucia est filia. Quinque. Clemens est servus. Sex. Grumio est coccus. Septem. Cerberus est canis. Octo. Caecilius est in tablino. Nones. Metella est in atrio. Decem. Quintus est in triclinio. Undecem. Lucia est in horto. Duodecem. Clemens est in cubiculo. Tridecem. Grumio est in culina. Quattrodecem. Cerberus est in via. Quindecem. Pater est in tablino. Pater in tablino scribit. Sedecem. Metella est in atrio. Mater in atrio sedet. Septem decem. Filius est in triclinio. Filius in triclinio bibet. Duo de viginti. Filia est in horto. Filia in horto leget. Unde viginti. Servus est in cubiculo. Servus in cubiculo laborat. Viginti. Coccus est in culina. Coccus in culina laborat. Viginti uno. Canis est in via. Canis in via dormit. Okay, now let's go through it again. Let's do some translation, and I will help you a little bit with these, so you can write these down or type them out, as the case may be. Familia. So familia, you can see what that means. That obviously means family. One thing to keep in mind as we go through this is familia means something a little different to the Romans than it does to us. We usually think of family as people that are related to you somehow, especially by blood. But for the Romans, familia, it almost means something more like a household. So we see all those people in the picture, but they're not all relatives. A number of those people are slaves. They are members of the household. So they're considered part of the familia, but we would not consider them family like we would in English. So the first sentence says, Caecilius est pater. Caecilius is obviously a proper noun, that is the person's name. Est means is, pater means father. So we would translate this sentence something like, Caecilius is the father. Now notice, in English, we use words like a or the. They're called indefinite articles. So either one works fine here. Latin does not have them. It's going to do a trick later on to use something like it. But so in English, we're not going to translate that Caecilius is father. We'd probably write something like Caecilius is a father or the father. As you'll hear me say a lot, we want to make the Latin speak English. The second sentence says, Metella est mater. So we can see Metella again is a proper noun, that is a name. We already know what est is. Pater means father, mater means mother. So we would probably translate this something like Metella is the mother. The third sentence says Quintus est filius. Again, Quintus we see as a proper noun. We can see it's talking about a boy because the noun ends in us. That is a masculine ending. So we see Metella is a mother. Quintus is a filius. He is a son. Number 4 says Lucia est filia. So now we see the ending for that noun has changed. So Quintus is filius. He is a son, which means filia must mean something like daughter, or really female child. So we'd say Lucia is a daughter, or we could even translate that Lucy. The fifth sentence says Clemens est servus. So again, Clemens, that is a proper noun. Probably in English we'd say Clemens. He is servus. Here's one of the times when Latin can be a bit tricky. You can see the word servant comes from servus, but you're going to want to be careful in translating this. We should always translate servus as slave. So servus does not mean a servant. It is not somebody who was hired or paid for their services. Servus is an enslaved person. We're going to want to keep that in mind, especially as we go through the story. It also helps us to better understand some things in the New Testament as well. So translate servus as slave. We'll talk more about the Roman Empire and slavery. There's a good chapter for that. For now, just keep in mind, slavery in Rome is not quite the same as slavery in the United States in the mid-18th century. Number 6 says grumio est coccus. So grumio is a proper noun. Here's probably the first time that we see a word we don't recognize it. So we have a couple of options here. We could look it up on page 6. It'll tell you what it is. If we keep going in the story, we'll get a hint as to what coccus is. I'll let you look it up though and write it in. The 7th one says Cerberus est canis. So again, we see Cerberus is a proper noun. Cerberus is how we would say that in English. And for canis, you can probably see there's an English word in there, and by looking at the picture, you probably get a pretty good idea of what canis is. I'll let you look that up and write it down. The 8th sentence says, Caecilius est in tablino. So now we see that name again. We know est is, so it's Caecilius is. In means pretty much the same thing in Latin as it does in English. So Caecilius is in something. He's in the tablinum, but the ending is changed because it's in the ablative. It's in the case that tells us there's a location involved here. So you can look up in tablino in page 6 in your book and decide how you want to translate that. Number 9 says Metella est in atrio. So again, now we have Metella is in something. In the atrium, in English we would say atrium. And atrium is a pretty good translation for that word into the English. As a rule, if you don't know what a noun means, we just bring it into the language. So Metella is in the atrium is a pretty good translation for number 9. Number 10 says quintus est in triclinio. So again, we have the proper noun and we have the verb est. So the triclinio. So here you have a couple of options. Your book will give you a definition, but once again, this is a word that's kind of hard to bring into English. So it might say dining room, but triclinium is not the worst way to do this. So you can see the word tri there. There's 3. Clinia has to do with lying down. We'll talk more about the triclinium later, but you can translate it dining room or triclinium. I am going to let you do the rest of these on your own. You can write them out or type them out for me and submit them via Moodle. You'll see that it go all the way to number 21. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me, send me a note, and I will try and help you out with them. Buona fortuna!